Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. It's Thursday, January 30th. This is the Education and Culture Committee. Really appreciate everyone who's here in person and also online. Have my colleague, Councilmember Gabe Albornoz, here, and we will be joined by Councilmember Kristin Mink. We have a packed agenda here of interrelated items, so I wanted to make sure we started on time because we do have a hard stop around 3 o'clock. Before we jump in, I did want to take a moment just to speak to everyone in our educational ecosystem about why we're here. We took up an update of the Anti-Racist Audit in November of 2023, so just a little over a year ago. And since that time, a lot's happened. A lot's happened in our country, a lot's happened in our county, and in our schools. In particular, if you're Black, Brown, Jewish, or Muslim, or an immigrant, first-generation student, or a member of our LGBTQ plus community, you, I'm sure, like many of us, have been troubled by the specific and general actions targeted towards your communities and in the national news, not only here at home. I want to say that none of us here are okay with that. That's why we've taken a lot more actions than many, many jurisdictions. Your local leaders, this committee, this council, the school system, I know I speak for all of us when I say that none of this is acceptable. And we're going to do all that we can, and we have to do all that we can to make sure everyone feels welcome in our schools and in our community. With that said, we know that doesn't always happen. Indeed, the results of the anti-racist audit told us it's not happening in our schools. And the topics that we're going to talk about today, restorative justice and an update on the anti-racist audit, its recommendations and its implementation, they are interrelated topics, which is one of the reasons we're going to have both presentations back to back before we get into questions. Being anti-racist requires vigilance, requires action. Running a good restorative justice program requires vigilance, requires action. And that type of systemic change doesn't happen easy because you are confronting a system that was designed to not produce those results. And I think we just have to be honest about that. When we met last November, we talked about these items, but we've had some things come up since that have troubled and hurt our community. We're going to continue this conversation, and while we're having a very targeted conversation today, much of this work, as you know, embeds the conversations we have all the time at the committee around everything we're talking about, whether it's student achievement, whether it's student attendance, they're all interrelated. And so while we're going to focus on anti-racism audit and the restorative justice today, we could be talking about any issue within our school system and have to talk about these issues. I want to lift up in particular the very recent and public really unfortunate anti-Black events at Wooten High School. I was able to attend a meeting recently in the wake of that racist attack on a Black student, which was bad enough, but then we had failures in systems where it was unreported for a long period of time, and students themselves, impacted students, had to organize and ask for redress. The Black Student Unit, I want to really just give them a lot of shout out because that was hard to do. At that meeting, MCPS representatives spoke frankly and openly about the challenges, as did parents. And so two things can be true at the same time. We can want these things to be better, and we can realize that things aren't where they need to be. And that's that kind of the spirit in which we're getting into the conversation today. So we want to talk about where we are, what we've seen, what we're doing, and then be frank about what we're not doing and what we need to be doing, and have this be a continuing conversation. So I just wanted to start with that. I don't normally give that much of opening remarks, but I think this issue is of such importance that it needed to be framed appropriately. I want to thank Doug Prouty, who is his first meeting as the E&C staff, who's not a stranger to the committee or to the council and into the county as far as education. As I mentioned, we're going to have both presentations back to back. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Prouty to tee us up with anything that he thinks we need to do. and then we will have the rest of the conversation. And I've asked that we do no more than 15 minutes. So if you want to come in under, you're welcome to do that. All right. So, Mr. Prouty.
Thank you very much, Council Vice President Jawando and Councilmembers Albornoz and Mink. I'm Doug Prouty, the Senior Budget and Policy Analyst for the Council. The work session today, as Vice President Jawando mentioned, is on the Anti-Racist Audit and Restorative Justice and MCPS. A little background, the Anti-Racist Audit was initiated in 2020. MCPS contracted with the Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium to administer the audit, which was conducted by surveys of students, parents, staff, and community groups, as well as focus groups, input and feedback mechanisms, and further analysis. The impetus for the anti-racist audit was disparities in student outcomes in reading and math, in AP and IB enrollment, in graduation rates, in suspension and discipline rates, as well as in staffing. Staff did not match the student demographics in many schools. Unfortunately, that persists today. Restorative justice, a process of building relationships in a school and restoring, repairing, or healing when harm has occurred, was developed and implemented in a number of school systems in response to the same disparities, as well as a recognition that discipline policy and practices were contributing to the school-to-prison pipeline. Restorative justice was mentioned by numerous speakers at the recent MCPS budget hearings and was a topic of discussion at the Board of Education budget work session this morning. The Education Committee and the Council, as Council Vice President Jawando mentioned, has heard a number of updates on these topics. The most recent was November 2023. The panel is here today to provide more current information, in particular on how the anti-racist audit recommendations are being incorporated into the new MCPS strategic plan. And we'll also hear updates on restorative justice implementation data and examples of how it's being used in 2 schools. The panel is joined by Wylea Chase, Director of Operations and Community Engagement for the Black and Brown Coalition for Equity, Educational Equity and Excellence, who will speak after the MCPS presentation. I also want to acknowledge the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington, who sent a letter on restorative justice following up on their letter from November of 2023. I provided the committee members with copies of this letter for their consideration and want to thank the JCRC for their work with MCPS on restorative justice implementation. I also want to acknowledge the presence of Melissa Goman, the co-chair of the Commission on Juvenile Justice, in our audience. Thank you for being here and for your work. And finally, I want to thank the MCPS team here today, as well as the staff in central office who prepared this presentation. Stephanie Sharon and team have been responsive, transparent, and collaborative in their work with me and with other council staff. So thank you for your work on behalf of the students of MCPS.
Thank you, Mr. Prouty. Good job. You passed. First one. So we'll, as I said, we'll do the anti-racist update, the restorative justice update, which I'm assuming is going to come from this side, and then Ms. Chase as the representative of the MCCPTA and Black and Brown Coalition and herself as a parent. And we'll have, so we'll go 15, 15, and 5 is the plan, and then the rest is conversation. All right, so let's start.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Councilmember Jawando, for teeing us up in the way that you did, because everything you said is 100% accurate. This slide is just to show us the main finding that we got from the anti-racist audit. When you took 200 pages and you narrowed it down to one main thing, was the implementations of the policies and the applications of our best practices as a district greatly differ from school to school, stating that we are fragmented, and we are still fragmented. And I think it's important to acknowledge that right off the bat, that while we are still working on that, we are still facing a lot of inconsistencies in our implementation. Next slide, thank you. So the anti-racist audit and action plan were divided up into 2 categories. One, on the all the way on the left, are our cross-domain recommendations. The ones on the right, you see, are domain-specific recommendations. I think it's important to note that in the audit, it very clearly states that if we don't get to the items on the left, able to do the items on the left, we will never get to the items on the right, as far as being able to address that fragmentation. Since we last met, progress has been made on some of those domain-specific actions that we listed in the action plan, and it has been updated on our action planning document on our website so that you can see what changes have occurred. But to be clear, however, most students, staff, and families will not yet see or feel the impact of these actions. As you are aware, MCPS faced substantial leadership transitions and disruption last year. These changes made it nearly impossible to implement some of the cross-domain recommendations and to create systems and structures necessary for real change. For example, the cross-office accountability structure that is identified in the Anti-Racist Action Plan was never implemented. The action teams were developed, they created actions, but the continuous changes in leadership made it extremely difficult for some of those action teams to actually make progress. Additionally, the strategic plan and the Anti-Racist Action Plan were operating separately as separate entities, which interfered with our addressing one of the very first issues around being coherent. Next slide. So when we last presented to you, we thought we would be further along by now. And to be honest, we're frustrated about that fact as well. The encouraging news is that we do believe we're getting back on track to address the long-term systemic changes that are needed in our system. The superintendent has very clearly directed us to use the development of our new strategic plan to address the system barriers identified in the audit and the action plan. What's important to note in the action plan is that they said we employ many of the best practices. The problem was the implementation. In a December message to the community, Dr. Taylor said that we believe every student deserves an equitable and equal opportunity to succeed, regardless of race or background. For me, this is not just a statement. It's a commitment to take meaningful action to ensure all students have access to the resources, support, and opportunities they need to succeed. This means actively working to dismantle barriers, challenge biases, and create an inclusive and welcoming environment in our schools. And we are working with that charge. This presents an opportunity to incorporate the anti-racist audit findings and action plan directly into the new strategic plan that we are building. Instead of two different plans, it becomes the way to do everything in MCPS from the ground up. Everything about how we approach the strategic plan is different from how it has been done before. The questions we ask ourselves and others and how we organize as a direct result of the Anti-Racist Action Plan. I'd like to spend a few minutes now explaining how the Anti-Racist Audit and Action Plan are embedded in the development of the new strategic plan, and then we're going to share some of more specific actions from the Anti-Racist Audit that have been accomplished since we last spoke. Next slide. So that middle quote will look familiar because I just shared it with you. And that first quote is what Dr. Taylor shared with the entire, all the administrators at the first A&S meeting in August, and that is our organization is perfectly designed to get the results you are getting. The challenge of the Anti-Racist Action Plan and really trying to create change is it's not about one-and-done practices or one-and-done training. It's about completely transforming the systems and structures that which we operate with to ensure that equity and anti-racism is a driver of change, not an add-on. And that is the true challenge that we have been facing. Next slide. So this is something that actually we interviewed all three of you individually around the new strategic plan way back over the summer. And this is something that we shared and that we are addressing. So right off the bat, we are taking a look at this new strategic plan in a completely different way because we want to make sure that we're actually addressing the students that we have in front of us, right? Not just racially and demographically, but also the experiences that they're having. Councilmember Jawando just said that we are existing in a education system that has largely remained unchanged, right, for 100 years. I would venture to say that some of the structures that we have all the way back where we look at that 1970 mark are not that different than what we have today. Next slide. So part of being anti-racist is a commitment to critical reflection of how our beliefs, practices, and interpretations contribute to inequitable outcomes by race. As part of our strategic planning process, we use these two questions in every single phase of planning that we've engaged in. What are the systems and the beliefs and values that uphold these systems that must be in place for MCPS to effectively implement the best practices that we know we have with consistency? And the second question is, I'm sorry, those were the two questions. My bad. Next slide. So compared to the strategic plans that we've done in the past, we're spending a great deal more time getting input and feedback from our community for each phase of the planning process. As we explain each phase, you're going to see how the anti-racist audit is clearly embedded in it. So the first phase, you all were a part of that, phase one. We engaged over 200 individuals in order to start building out what are the systemic barriers that we need to address as a system. In phase 2, we engaged over 180 diverse stakeholders to use the phase 1 input to do a root cause analysis and identify recommended approaches and systems of accountability. And we're currently in phase 3. Phase 3 is where we're crafting our goals and objectives that are based on the input from phase 2. We're going to go back out to the community to share what we've done to make sure that we're on the right track. And then the board's going to be finalizing this plan in May. Next slide. So this is just a quick snapshot for you of all the groups that were engaged in that phase 1. If you could click again. These are the specific questions that we asked each of the group. Click one more time. And you can find on our website the phase 1 report that was completed by Shared Accountability on the phase 1. So we used this information then to inform phase 2. So in phase 2, we had that work session that I mentioned, and participants were divided into 7 work groups based on the main themes from the phase 1 report. This is never how we have approached our strategic planning before, but we do really believe that unless you're naming it and putting it on the table, that it will not get addressed. There are many ways to engage in a root cause analysis. We actually engaged this group in using a systems iceberg approach, which is the same approach that was used in the Anti-Racist Action Plan. And as you can see, it gets to the systems and structures and mindset that uphold these systems and structures. So for example, if you click, this information that I'm just going to very quickly show on the screen is actually directly from the phase 2 report, which is now on our website. EML students, that's our event. That's who we're focusing on. Then what are the identified patterns in the data that we see? For instance, they found when they engaged in the analysis, EML students have a lower proficiency rate than non-EML students. Grade 5 proficiency, level of materials has been much lower than the general. What we have found when we've engaged in root cause analyses before is that that's where we stop. We stop there, and then we start identifying actions. And that's where you start dealing with tinkering on the edges, not really addressing the problem. So we're taking this a step further. The step further is after the patterns are identified, what are the systems and the structures that are causing this to occur? In this particular group, if you click the button, you'll see that there are a variety of systems and structures that are embedded into how we do business in MCPS that are creating barriers, and this is based on the feedback from this group, that are preventing us from getting the results that we want to get. And then the last component is, what are the mental models? What are the beliefs that are fueling this so that we really need to address to create change? I think it's also important to note that these groups were compiled not just of staff members, but of students, of families, all coming together to address the root cause analysis. So then after they did the root cause analysis, then each group then recommended approaches to address these things and then recommended structures for accountability. Like I said, that phase 2 report is now live. We can email you a copy of it so that you can see it. And then we are now moving into our phase 3. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Alston in order to talk very briefly about where we are with phase 3 and then the high-level actions that we have taken since the last meeting.
Thank you. So as you begin to look at phase 3, it's important to know that what we did was we used the report along with information from the Maryland Blueprint, in addition to the superintendent's entry plan and the anti-racist audit to inform and develop the draft goals that you see here. And so what you see are the draft goals, and we would absolutely love your feedback on those, and we will send you a clean copy so that you're able to review and provide us some additional feedback. As a reminder, these are the goals. This is where we want to be. Why we are not there yet at this phase is that, where we are at this phase now is developing the strategies. So while the words on the left are similar to what you might see in the past, and similar to what you will see in other districts, what you will see different is that the bullets on the right show how these goals are rooted in equity and anti-racism. When you read the report, you will see that the phase 2 participants also gave us recommendations and suggestions for accountability. On January 16th, we had another opportunity for a work session with these cross sections of MCPS staff. The participants were divided into 5 different work groups, and each one had a specific goal that had been identified. The work groups unpacked the phase 2 report and began to develop the objectives for each of those goals. The questions on the right are there to show you how they were differently working to hold ourselves accountable, to be anti-racist, and who are working to be transparent. For each recommended objective, the work groups had to respond to the following questions. And we'll use similar questions when we get to the strategy phase. This way, we'll ensure that we're very clear on how our strategic plan is anti-racist, and how it will directly impact the experience of our student groups. This is very different from strategic plans that we have done in the past. And so those questions specifically ask, how is this recommendation anti-racist? How does it specifically address the root causes and recommendations that have been outlined in the Phase 2 report? How does it connect to the Maryland Blueprint? And how does it address the outcomes for our specific student groups? Our Black, African American students, our Hispanic, Latino students, our emerging multilingual learners, and our students that are receiving special education services. When we think about the next steps, from there we'll begin to get feedback on the goals and objectives from participants from phases 1, 2, and 3. We'll form new committees that will be created in February to develop the draft strategies to meet those identified goals. We'll create culture-responsive opportunities for the community to provide feedback in April. And then, as mentioned previously, in May, the Board of Education will vote to finalize that strategic plan. And then offices and schools will create office and school improvement plans that will align themselves with our actions. From there, structures for parent engagement that favor, excuse me, I went to the wrong page. From there, they will align to the strategic plan. Thank you. We mentioned earlier that we actually did do many of the domain-specific actions, and therefore we won't start from scratch as we begin looking at the strategic plan and its implementation. You can see from the action documented, but I'd like to highlight just a few. When we think about our equity-based data and monitoring tools, last time we presented to you, we were talking about the beginning of the launch for the public-facing data dashboards that allow our community to see critical data on our schools and district. Since then, we have expanded this work to additional dashboards for both the public and internal staff. If you search on our website, School Profiles, you will see the public-facing dashboards that display data for the district and individual schools on academic data points, as well as special education, safety and security, as well as staffing and enrollment. We've also had the opportunity to build out robust monitoring tools to track our student progress, but also to inform equitable and anti-racist decision-making. The dashboards include graduation validation, chronic absenteeism, academic monitoring, as well as usage for parent view. The dashboards not only provide all staff the ability to examine and drill down as they look into the data, but also provide ways to easily make it easy visualizations for central office supervisors to support the monitoring and accountability for each school. Staff have reported that these dashboards have been a game changer in not only analyzing the data, but also their ability to share the data with the community as well as their progress. So, for example, the Parent View dashboard. As you think about that dashboard, it not only shows school staff, parents that are activated, but it also shows those who are actually utilizing the Parent View on a regular basis. This has been able to allow schools to assist in identifying the families that need support in connecting to these resources and communications that the schools can provide. The dashboards are a great start, but they serve as the foundation as how we will look at our data to drive decision-making. Our next level of work is the professional learning that our district needs to continue and how to teach our staff to utilize these dashboards in a way that allows for additional data monitoring and to allow it to be a tool to inform decision-making from an anti-racist lens. And that professional learning is ongoing. As you think about our parent engagement, we revised the parent engagement and parent engagement policies, the community engagement and parent engagement policies, to make them more explicitly anti-racist and culture responsive. Both include accountability measures and tools and structures to ensure that we are engaging our parents and families and the most impacted individuals by our decisions. We have created tools that support the ideas of the policy, and we have trained every school-based staff and district leader on how to utilize these tools. An example of that is that if you look, you will see the first page of our culture responsive planning document that all leaders have been told to use for all engagement and communications. We've also developed a template for creating culture responsive materials that help and support our caregivers understand and navigate our system. The front side was written using inclusive language, and every parent received the same information. The backside is designed for each school to put in their own school-specific information, and this design ensures consistency while also ensuring that parents provide the information that they need for their local schools. Next slide. This summer, we provided mandatory professional learning for all school-based administrators to support them in learning and around the hate bias as outlined on our anti-racist action plan. Using a grant from MSDE, we were able to develop and create signage for schools and offices to more effectively communicate a shared understanding of what hate bias is. During this learning, we were able to share our expectations for students and staff about being upstanders and not bystanders. During that learning, we also reviewed the new tiered reporting structure and process and elevated how our previous process disproportionately criminalized our children of color, particularly our Black students. We also developed 7 15-hour courses to support our teachers and staff in better understanding the students and families that we have been charged to serve. The courses align themselves to the hate bias task force committees that the County Council developed earlier in the year. We've also developed learning for students focusing on the Speak Up strategy protocols, which provide our students in ways to honor humanity and interrupt hate when and if it occurs in our schools. We've also rolled out our civic engagement and civil discourse tools, resources, and supports to assist our schools in creating the conditions to empower our students and staff to interrupt, disrupt, and dismantle forms of oppression and hate bias. The implementation of the aforementioned items resulted in school administrators increasing their capacity to identify the various tiers of hate bias instances and more accurately report them. It's resulted in a decrease in hate bias instances due to the expansion of the administrator's knowledge, as well as a widespread use of the Speak Up protocol to prevent these instances from happening further. When we began, next slide. We began by creating our equitable teaching and learning framework, and this was designed to guide and steer our work. From there, we focused on directing and developing and defining what professional learning should look like in our district and ensure that it is designed to look and designed for us to ensure that professional learning was designed in an anti-racist manner. To date, 944 central office staff members have participated in this learning, including 398 leaders in our MCAP and MCBOA levels, as well as 595 specialists in our MCA and SEIU level. Satisfaction for these sessions content has never dropped below 96%. We've also been working on developing central service staff ability to identify policies and practices that have been racist, have racist outcomes so that we can be charged with moving forward. Based on the need shared on that slide, you will see that after participating in our courses, we have seen gains in leaders' ability to, for example, identify problematic policies and its compared to our initial goals and phases. So now what we've been focused on is demonstrating growth from that. So 95% of our leaders have successfully demonstrated that skill. Now that leaders have learned these skills, we have been working on how we're supporting them in the practice of implementing them in their departments so they can begin to track the data on how changes in policy and practices impact our students as well as our families.
Thank you. A lot of stuff to talk about, but we're going to go right into restorative justice so that we can save for discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us today. We are going to start.
If you could just
I'm sorry.
introduce yourself. I'm sorry.
My name is Shauna K. Jornby. I'm the Director of Student Engagement and Behavioral Health. And we are pleased to come to you today to share some updates about restorative justice in MCPS from our last conversation in November. Next slide, please. We are going to begin with some of the more important people in the room. They're the leaders of the work at their local schools. We have 3 schools that we'd like to highlight today, but only 2 that we'll be speaking about. We have with us Principal April Longest of Farmland Elementary School, who's going to share a little bit about the work of implementing restorative justice at her school, and also Principal Craig Staten from Julius West Middle School, who's going to share about some of the successes with restorative approaches in his building. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Principal Longest. Next slide, please.
Good afternoon, council members. You can hear me okay? Okay, great. As she introduced me, I am April Longest and the proud principal that serves at Farmland Elementary School. Farmland is actually the 2nd largest elementary school in Montgomery County, and we serve over 860 students at our school. Our community is very unique because it represents a wide range of cultural backgrounds. More than 140 students at our school are multilingual learners, and many of whom speak 3 different languages. Additionally, we are proud to offer our Learning for Independence program, where students develop life and academic skills and earn a certificate upon graduation. Creating a strong sense of belonging and inclusion is at the heart of everything we do at Farmland. At Farmland, we take a proactive approach to restorative practices. We prioritize preventative while fostering a student-centered learning environment. Through a series of our 4 town hall sessions with students in grades 3 through 5, we sought to highlight their shared similarities, foster a sense of belonging within the school community, and deepen their understanding of the impact of harmful language. Additionally, we emphasized how restorative practices aid in repairing harm, while reinforcing that these approaches complement rather than replace the consequences outlined in the Code of Conduct. The town halls were designed in response to observed challenges with problem solving and navigating difficult interactions. We recognized the need for explicit instruction on how certain words and actions can be unacceptable, hurtful, and harmful, ultimately impacting the sense of belonging within our school community. Despite previous efforts to equip students with strategies for handling such situations, it became evident that these strategies had not been fully internalized. With the support of our staff development teacher, school counselor, restorative practice instructional specialist, and equity initiative instructional specialist, we developed 3 town halls sessions in which students in each grade participated together. Another lesson was held within the classroom. The 3 town halls were focused on identity, hateful and harmful words, and the application of the Code of Conduct and restorative practices in various scenarios. The classroom lessons focused specifically on restorative practices. To ensure inclusivity and a broad range of perspectives, we actively engage staff, students, and parents in the development of the town halls and the classroom lessons. We met with grade level team leaders and teams to gather feedback and facilitate their participation in lessons delivery without requiring them to create the content. And that was huge. Students in grades 3 through 5 completed a survey responding to prompts such as, one time a student said, "It made me feel blank," and "What did you do in response?" These insights were instrumental in shaping our lessons and discussions. We then took our presentation to parents and provided multiple opportunities for them to give us feedback on it. Initially, we met with a small group of parents to discuss the presentation and shared student feedback, and later presented it to the PTA, and then we shared it with our community at large, allowing them to provide us feedback on it. The important part for me was when sharing that presentation, we also shared the words kids were saying during recess time, and that was something that was very surprising for parents to hear what exactly students were saying. 3 of the town hall sessions occurred as grade level discussions in our all-purpose room. They were grouped by classes, and they were led by myself, the staff development teacher, and the counselor. In the first session, we talked about identity and belonging. The students then sorted words based on their survey results under racial harassment, physical and mental disability harassment, religious harassment, profanity, and national origin harassment. During the town halls, we asked teachers to facilitate discussions with their class groups, allowing students to reflect on how these words impacted others, whether they contributed to the sense of belonging. Additionally, students reviewed the Speak Up strategy, which was introduced during our No Place for Hate assemblies. Also, in the classroom, the teachers did a subsequent lesson, which was a follow-up, and this was led by the classroom teachers. Since teachers had already had this training in these practices, they guided students in understanding restorative approaches can be used to promote learning and community healing, the importance of repairing harm through accountability, and the role of logical consequences in restorative approaches. The final town hall was the most impactful, focused on helping students apply these concepts to real-life scenarios. Students were introduced to the Code of Conduct. They looked at it. They looked at the philosophy of fostering a positive, respectful, orderly, and safe environment. We emphasized the expectations written in it. My words, actions, and attitudes demonstrate respect for myself and others at all times. I seek to correct any harm that I have caused to others in the school community. Students engaged in scenario-based activities during which they applied the restorative practices and used the Code of Conduct to determine appropriate levels of intervention and identified logical consequences for both the aggressor and the victim. These exercises help solidify their understanding of how restorative practice align with the Code of Conduct, the district's Code of Conduct, and support a positive school culture. Following the final town hall, we solicited feedback from students. They said, "I think the most important thing I learned was to be inclusive and kind, not bully people just because they are different, to be an ally when someone is being bullied, and to use the Speak Up strategy. The aggressor should face reasonable consequences, but the most important thing is to be an ally." To further and strengthen our efforts with families, we invited Shauna Kay and also Floyd Branch, our restorative approaches instructional specialist, to speak with our parents about the Code of Conduct and restorative practices so they understood how they work together. Parents responded positively from this experience. In closing, our partnership between students, staff, and family remains at the forefront of our work. We remain committed to building a school culture that fosters belonging, accountability, and meaningful growth for students. Thank you.
Thank you.
At this time, I'm going to ask Principal Staten to talk to us about the secondary level and some of the work that's happened with restorative approaches in a school.
Good afternoon. I'm Craig Staten, principal of Julius West Middle School. I want to thank you for inviting me to this meeting. Julius West is the, similar to Farmland, we're the largest, actually, middle school in Montgomery County. We have 1,360 students presently. We have about 40% farms. We are diverse across all cultural groups. Our largest subgroup is Hispanic at 33%. And our story really spans over a 3 to 5 year period. So there was pre-pandemic where we functioned. The kids were not much different than they are now. And over that period, pre-pandemic, our suspensions hovered around 25 a year. Post-pandemic, kids came back, we skyrocketed. And mainly because of kids were dysregulated. There was a lack of structure, not blaming parents or the community. It was just the pandemic itself. We had some serious challenges. At the same time, our demographics were changing. We went from about 25% farms to about 40. Kids came in, you've heard this story before, just not really knowing how to function in a school setting. Their peer relations were fractured. They didn't know how to dialogue. They didn't know how to talk to each other. And hence, there was conflict with some regularity. And we were up over 100, I'm going to be honest, up over 100 suspensions. And that was really, really rare. Not only rare, that was unheard of at Julius West. So we had some serious work to do in 2021 when we came back. The placement of a restorative justice coordinator really helped significantly. I know that's only one person, but I began with my team to really look at how can we structure this position, this person, so that we can really attack this issue. So our restorative justice coordinator is partially released from classes. We began to look at our suspensions very closely. Who are we suspending? Why are we suspending? What are the reasons that they're being suspended for? And how can we address this? Because the prison to pipeline, right, the prison to pipeline pattern was real. And I know firsthand, being in this community for a long time, and I've seen kids leave Julius West, go to Richard Montgomery, and some not make it. So we really had to look at how we're going to keep kids in school. And that was our goal, keeping kids in school. And so the circles that we conducted more circles than we suspended. And in those circles, we found a lot. We found out a lot about kids. That some of the issues that they were engaging in or had conflict with were minor. They were things like he or she looked at me wrong. He or she said something to me. And prior to having that coordinator, all right, administrators, counselors did some of that work for sure before we had a restorative justice coordinator. Yes. But having that designated person take the time so that we could continue with some of the work we had to do around the building allowed us to really dig deep into what was happening. And we found out that we could resolve about 50% of our issues with just dialogue, with just conversation. And kids were being returned to class. We did some other things, town halls, which we started about 4 years ago. We continue to have today. We just had one today. We have one at the beginning of every marking period because we want to make sure that students hear the same messages around what we expect from them, what we expect among their peers. We actually hold circles in those town hall meetings with kids. But now we also do celebrations with kids. We celebrate their successes. We celebrate how well they're interacting with one another. We celebrate how, they are taking control of the school in a positive way. We track and monitor our circles, our discussions, our dialogue sessions with kids, and we look at recidivism rates. And we have found that over the last 2 years that while our discussions, dialogue sessions, circles with kids still remain, actually they're lower now, still remain constant, the recidivism rate is lower, meaning the same kids are not coming back for more circles. It's just a remarkable turnaround. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we are in a different time right now. Kids are more used to school again, but we couldn't count on the fact that just let time go by and let kids settle in. We had to take action. Our suspensions now are, the exact number is 15 today. And those are for serious things such as fights. And when kids come back to school, from situations, altercations, conflict, we have circles. We talk to them about how they're reentering the building. So we're really proud of the work and the accomplishments of the program, but it's not really one person. At this time, we are actually utilizing more of our staff. We're building the capacity of our staff to hold sessions, dialogue sessions with kids, teachers, counselors. Administrators have always pretty much done them. So it's not really one person. And the one person we do have, Mr. Brutus, I think you've met him, really spends more of his time supporting staff, supporting teachers, conducting training, and still working with kids.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Mr. Jordan, so the time check here.
I got you.
Just be as focused as you can. Thank you.
We're going to power right through, and I'm just going to give you the updates. So these were specific updates from the November meeting in terms of commitments that we had made to make some improvements in implementation based on community feedback. So prior to that, we had made improvements based on some of the research studies that were out there linked to capacity, commitment, and consistency. And they required local support at each school, so we implemented the coaches at each school, including a stipend for people like Mr. Brutus. We were able to implement additional specialists to support in a cluster-like model, and those have been going pretty steady over the last 3 years. The updates from last year, including further engagement of the community, which is the district challenge of ours, and you could hear a little bit from Principal Longus, who spoke about how she engages her parents and PTA in the process. Requesting of publishing of resources and supports, and you can see that on the website. All the coaches are listed, so you know who's at what school and which specialist supports which coach or which school. Including the consents and the evaluation. Those are also posted publicly on the website. The action planning is still happening for our reactive schools only. That's continuing, as well as the evaluation of our schools, which started 2 years ago, and we're entering our third set of evaluations this year. So those results will be ready in the end of the late spring. Next slide, please. That's all right. That's okay. One thing that's lovely is being able to see where the coaches are. So 211 schools is a wide degree of variability. Coaches have a wide degree of experience. Some are first-year coaches, and some are on year 3. So in evaluating the coaches, this is where they say they are. Here are the trend patterns. The coaches feel their greatest expertise is in our community circles, which are mostly about relationship building, self-care strategies, mindfulness or resetting strategies, and supporting with punitive versus restorative approaches. Our coaches also report where they feel their least expertise is going to be in formal restorative circles. So those are going to be the higher level, more intensive circles where support's needed, more challenging issues. Again, reintegration practices, which Principal Staten spoke about, which is critical to safety. So when we do training with well-being teams, we talk about reports from the Secret Service that talk about students who commit any mass acts of violence are likely to do so within 7 days of any separation from school, whether it's truancy, whether it's suspension, whether it's anxiety, whatever it is. So we really harp on reintegration. What do you do for a child that has been separated and returns within 7 days? They also would like to learn more about the brain science of emotional regulation. That's going to be a continuous conversation, particularly at our elementary school levels, right? How do I control these big feelings? Next slide, please. We wanted an update on the difference between year 1 evaluations and year 2 evaluations at all of our schools. And we're happy to report the progress on this. You can see the light blue being what our current schools are for last year's report, and our dark blue the year prior. And you can see the steady move of particularly our early schools, moving more into the intermediate lane. And that intermediate is where we want all our schools to be at minimum. Our mature schools are what we consider to be like model schools. We're not expecting that everywhere, but our mature schools are more of our model schools. The schools that we would take you on a visit for to show you how things are going, where you can see it clearly as you walk in, but intermediate is kind of that baseline. So we're happy to report that we've got far more intermediate schools, and we're at the point where we're hitting that halfway mark, right? So we have about 115 schools between intermediate and mature that are there. We have focused our efforts largely on reactive schools with the action plans. They have formalized action plans. Next year, we're going to be looking to shift that into early. I don't know how many schools we can address in early or how we're going to select which early schools to focus on, because we can only do about 20 at a time. So we're going to look at those to make the determination about which of those 82 schools to focus in on. We can go to the next slide. We're not going to talk about this much, other than to note that our district strengths actually remain the same between year 1 and 2. Even though we've had movement, where the strengths are in the county are similar. So having a coach, having that coach go to the PLC, having that coach do trainings, still a strength, right? Creating structures for having circles, like structures you've heard, town halls, things like that, still a strength. They're just in different order. If you take a look at the district challenges, they're similar to year 1. They're very similar. If you remember the year 1 challenges, quite similar, but again, in different order. The biggest thing to note is some of our schools feel challenged in engaging our parents. That's kind of the sum of it. They feel challenged in bringing the parents in to be a part of these processes, bringing the parents in to help design the town halls, bringing the parents in to help to facilitate some of what's happening in the schools. So that's an area that our coaches also reported that we need to strengthen. Next slide. Just sharing a little bit of data with you. MCPS still maintains the lowest suspension rate in the state. That's period. That's by a long shot. I think the closest to us is Garrett County. And Howard County does a wonderful job as well with a lot of their structures. That's a difficult thing to do and a difficult thing to maintain. Our unduplicated suspensions are 1.4. Only 1.4 of our 160,000 students are suspended in Montgomery County Public Schools. In the state of Maryland, that's about 5%. And so maintaining that is a priority in terms of keeping our kids in school, to receive critical first instruction, and to maintain positive attendance trends, which are on the improvement side. 13 out of 23 of our schools that are disproportionate, which are African American students with IEPs specifically compared to all other populations. And as identified by the state, we've made improvements in about half of those, and improvements for Black students specifically in about 14 of those schools. 5 of them supported by an RJ specialist. Next slide, please. All right. We are almost done, but this one is actually really important because I'm going to share with you a challenge that we have, and it's an important challenge. If you look at this particular chart, you will see the difference in suspensions between 2022 and 23 and 23 and 24. And like many educational or academic strategies, when you employ them, they're to the benefit of all students. So if you employ language strategies to help students better understand language, it is not just for your students learning language. It actually gives a net positive improvement on all your students, even students not learning language. Same thing when you apply universal design, right? And it's the same thing with RJ. It's not any different than any best practice strategy. You employ it, and you hope that it impacts a specific population. But the truth is, because you employ it to all students, it impacts all categories. So suspensions for African American students are down, but so are suspension for Asian students, and so are suspensions for white students, and so are suspensions for students of 2 or more races. And so the impact is across the board. It's universal. So it does have a great impact on overall suspension reduction. It has a great impact if you look at the climate, question number 12 on belonging. Schools where 8 specialists are have higher than average scores in the rest of the county in terms of I feel connected at my school. But that's really important because what it means is it doesn't have as great as we would like an impact on disproportionality. So because everybody is coming down, the ratio is still similar to what it is. So my comment there is RJ work is important, and it is a tool, one tool, but it can't exist without anti-bias work. Most of the variance in suspensions are subjective suspensions. They're going to be what we call suspensions that our school leaders have a choice on. So they're going to be disrespect and disruption, right? And while RJ supports and helps with those, right, it does for everybody else too. And so disproportionality requires more than only RJ as a strategy. So it's really important that I say that. If you look at the next slide, it'll show a little bit more of what I'm talking about there. Again, a reduction in the numbers, raw numbers of suspensions, and you can see a little variance in categories like farms, and then specifically in categories like special education. And that goes back to also identification of who are our special educators. So not just related to RJ, but also other social factors, other factors, right? If you look at the next slide, please, it talks about recidivism. Again, you wanted an update from one year to another. In the year prior, recidivism rates were 81% of students did not repeat. Last year, similar, 79% of students did not repeat. If you look at those bolded categories of disrespect and disruption, again, the only ones that are subjective, we've had a greater impact on that. So schools that have had an RJ specialist, 8 specific middle schools, show 70% less suspensions in disruption, show 44% less suspensions in disrespect. So just those subjective categories. RJ is most applied most often in our database. It seems to be for fighting. Principal Staten talked a little bit about conflict. That makes sense. Attack on a student. All right, and then the final slide is a summary. This is as quick as I can make it. What's working? So the evaluations are netting us a lot of information about a lot of schools, and they're very different, right? So having those evaluations help us to plan for those schools individually where we can. Having dedicated local support. So just as the specialists are important, the specialists are not enough at 8 to make an impact on all schools in the way that we want it to. So the coaches at each school, that tiny little stipend is really important because it allows us to have a point of contact at every school that receives the training. The coaches themselves have a log. It enables us to see what they're doing, right? So that we can address some of those things. So those coach stipends at each school. System-wide professional development remains important to be able to have that baseline, as well as strategic action planning for specific schools. We can't hit all of them, but specific ones that need more support are going to be important. And then monitoring with in-time feedback and support. So if something's not going well, if a school's not employing a strategy that's sound, if there are mistakes that have been made, having someone or someones to be able to address that, to be able to model it, to be able to correct it is really important. Final considerations that we have to think about. We, of course, got to think about the district challenges with continuing to engage our community. That's a must. So outside of that, we have to think about new legislation that's coming down the pike. For your consideration, House Bill 0192, which talks about restorative practices at all schools and the state being able to designate schools formally as restorative practice schools based on a state criteria. Second one, House Bill 0488, which talks about a data component, as in restorative approaches being reported out and published by the state, just like suspensions are published by the state. Those two things are looking to be active on July 1st, 2025, and they're in progress or in process. So we monitor those to see what the impact will be on the system, and do we have those data metrics set up? And if we don't, how do we get them set up? Do we have those supports set up to be able to enact some of those requirements, right? Just like you have blue ribbon schools or green ribbon schools, the idea of having schools as RJ-specific schools designated by the state, that's an interesting concept, right? A budget is always something that we have to consider. Again, will we have local support, yay or nay? If we don't, how do we shift that for schools to support using their own staffing? I know Principal Staten is one, Principal Ulrich is another. I know at Odessa Shannon they do this. They use their staffing creatively to release someone already within their staff. So if those stipends don't exist, how do we kind of restructure that? We know that there's some structural shifts happening, and just being cognizant of those to be able to make sure that the work continues in a meaningful way. Community engagement, again, always a thing. There are a lot of misconceptions about RJ out there in the community, and it's continuous work in addressing that. And then finally, this is really important, I believe, to safety, is reintegration. I can't talk about reintegration anymore about its importance because it's connected to the safety side of things, right? There's a lot of research out there from the Secret Service about the importance of any student disconnected for any reason, 7 days, reintegration. So those are things that we're focusing on coming up. And that's the fastest I can do it.
You did a great job. Thank you very much. Ms. Chase, and that's a lot to digest, but if you could just give your highlights, then we're going to spend a lot of time in conversation where everyone will get to speak again. But thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity. Excuse me. I wrote down some things that I'd like to share. So my name is Wylea Chase. I'm a Director of Operations and Community Engagement with the Black and Brown Coalition for Educational Equity and Excellence. I'm also, on the NAACP Parent Council, MCCPTA DEI Committee, Gaithersburg Cluster Coordinator, and the list goes on. I'm also a member of the Hate Bias Advisory Group, and some of my colleagues who are members of the Anti-Racist Advisory Group with MCPS are here too. Over the past year, both groups have worked diligently alongside MCPS, the Equity Unit, to address systemic inequities and to push for meaningful change in our school system. As we review the proposed FY26 operating budget, we must ask, where are the initiatives that we have been working on with MCPS? Where's the investment in the Black and brown children, students who face the compounding effects of racial bias and discrimination daily in our schools? To be more specific, we see an increase in security personnel in the budget, but we must ask, where's the investment in restorative practices? I understand that moving forward it will be embedded in the support services that our schools will receive, but what does that mean exactly? Restorative practices go beyond punitive measures to address the root causes of harm and conflict in our schools. They provide students with the tools to build relationships, repair harm, and cultivate a sense of belonging, especially in the communities that have been disproportionately impacted by racism and bias. Without a strong commitment to restorative practices, we continue to perpetuate a system that criminalizes and marginalizes Black and brown children rather than supporting their well-being and success. In a budget as significant as this, we hoped to see bold, intentional investment in the very students who need it most. While we definitely see it in terms of reading and math, we see those improvements, we just don't see it in the areas where our most marginalized feel unsafe and unseen. The students, families, and advocates in Montgomery County have long called for an equitable approach to education, one that ensures every child, regardless of race or background, has the opportunity to thrive. So we urge the Council to demand answers from MCPS on these things. Where are the programs and resources designed to dismantle race bias and promote equity? Where's the funding to sustain and expand the work we have been doing to make our schools more inclusive and just? How does this budget reflect a real commitment to the principles of anti-racism and student-centered policies? Empower and support those individuals in MCPS that the system hired to do their jobs. They are the experts in this work. Shauna K. Duranby, John Landsman, Stephanie Sharon, Dr. Anthony Alston, Janita Love, they can do this work. They need the latitude to do the work. Can't tell the system how to do their hiring and all those different things and don't purport to do that. This is just a recommendation and things that we ask that you pay attention to. Ensure that all resources mentioned here today actually not only get into the hands of parents, caregivers, and students, but that they know how to utilize it and that the information exists. Hold MCPS accountable to measurable outcomes. If all of these wonderful things are occurring, and they are, especially at those schools we know have the disproportionate suspension rates, are high and racist and anti-Black racist incidents that continue to occur, if they don't improve, how will the school administrators and their principal supervisors be held accountable? Remember that we are dealing with children. Why are they being recommended for suspensions? Why are they being recommended for and getting access to? Are they not being recommended for and getting access to higher level courses? Why does reading and math theater proficiency remain so poor for Black and brown students? What is the root cause associated with these things? As it relates to restorative practices, again, it's awesome to hear from these two principals in these wonderful schools how well it's working. But I think it's working because these two schools are engaged and involved. Their leadership has bought in. They are empowering their staff and students in this work, and clearly they value it. Let's implement and achieve the goal of ensuring that all of our schools can say the same. Our students deserve more than empty promises. They deserve real, tangible investments in their future, investments that reflect our county's stated commitment to equity and inclusion. And I want to say at the last, these are real people attached to this job, attached to this work, right? Those of us on the hate bias and anti-racist groups dedicated our time and energy to this. Everybody's busy. Everybody's got a lot going on. By the way, we don't get a stipend for this. We don't get paid for this, right? So clearly this means a lot to us. We know that we are not decision makers in this. But if we are asked for our time and our energy, then we would like to see some of that implemented here. And not that none of it has been. Some of it absolutely has been. But there are things that weren't, right, and that are not. And we would like to see it reflected back just a little bit. Again, we're not the end-all, be-all. We're not the end decision makers. But our time is valuable. Everybody's time is valuable. So don't ask us to be on it as a box checker. But some of that has to do with the folks doing this work that I mentioned need to be empowered to really do the work. And so I just want to mention that we respect them, we value them, the folks that I mentioned and folks that I didn't mention that do this work. And we're all human, and you know, things transpire, but it cannot be at the cost of our children. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your time, literally and figuratively, in preparing your remarks and participating on those many task force and all the other stuff you do that's doesn't have a title. So thank you. I want to thank the principals. I know you could be at work doing your job with your students, and appreciate you taking the time to be here. I missed Principal Staten. I had a great time at the, I don't know what you call it, at the end of the year. What was it? The
Jamboree.
Jamboree, yeah. Where the teachers and staff, including Principal Staten, play basketball against all the students in the school, and they rotate in. And I joined they let me join the staff team.
The whole day, though.
You didn't do the whole day, no. Yes, and just one of the many. You know, sometimes you can get back at some of the teachers you're mad at and all that, so it was good. And thank you for being here as well, and thank you to the MCPS staff. All right, we have a good hour here to get into some questions. I'm gonna model and be just. We could talk for the rest of the day, but this was a great start. To Ms. Chase's point, one of the things that we had a meeting earlier this week at the council to talk about the blueprint requirements, right? And you mentioned some state legislation that may be coming. One of the challenges with the blueprint, even though MCPS staff is working diligently on it, is that it's hard to do a plan that's that comprehensive all at once, and there's a lot of moving pieces, and you're trying to report back. There's large-scale systems we're trying to change, and oh, by the way, we're trying to be anti-racist. This country was founded on racist and operates in a racist paradigm, so right, like shifting that is hard, right? In the midst of everything else you're trying to do, I worry about a little bit of the paralysis that can happen when you look at an overwhelming problem. And so, if you could just talk briefly from your standpoint. And I'm going to ask that you all are as concise as possible, too. How are you planning in this development? I get that you got new leadership and all that and the strategic plan process, but how are we going to make sure that we don't get stuck in analysis paralysis and that we actually do things to address the real people that are on the ends of either the anti-racist audit or these young people who are dealing with conflict? I think it's something that I think about a lot.
So I can share, from my purview, I think I completely agree. And one of the things that we have really heard loud and clear, and you used very kind words of paralysis analysis, what we have heard from our community is we're kind of fed up with the fact that we keep giving input, feel like you're analyzing the problem, and we're not seeing consistent change across the board. So I want to acknowledge that right off the bat, that is really, it's even deeper than just analysis paralysis. It's very personal to folks. I think there's a couple different things that we need to do as a next step, and I do think they're going to be grounded in the strategic plan. The number one thing that we have heard across the board from our community, both internally and externally, is accountability. if we don't have strong accountability structures in place to make sure that the best practices that we know do work are actually being implemented, we are going to be stuck in analysis paralysis. And not only analysis paralysis, we're not going to create any change. And I think that can be done in a couple different ways. I do believe that the superintendent, with his restructuring and how he is creating his vision around how central offices support schools and what his expectations are going to do, are going to yield that. But the other component is that we are in the process of building out strong accountability metrics that are going to be aligned with what we're trying to make change with the anti-racist audit, from the strategic plan all the way down to the schools. One of the things that we hear from our community is, I don't really even understand how are you monitoring? What is it looking like? You got 75,000 data points. Like, I want to see it simple. Are we making progress? Are we not? So I think by doing that, that coherence will be created. The other component of that is that we really need to build out our professional learning for our staff to really be creating change, and there's an accountability component in that. But one of the things that we've been doing that I think is a mistake that needs to change is, and this happens in pockets but not everywhere, is how are we embedding equity from the start of what we're doing and anti-racism from the start of what we're doing, instead of being in a reactive form. So or a add-on form. So if people are looking at my professional learning on the English curriculum and the professional learning on the math curriculum, and then I have my anti-racist training over here, it's an add-on. It's not embedded into what we do. So those are some of the things and the structures that are going to be built into the strategic plan that I think are going to yield better results. I think it's going to take time. I don't think it's going to be quick and easy, but I think the accountability component is going to be critical so that we're being transparent and creating that trust.
I appreciate that. The tracker. So we had this session in November. I noticed my staff and we've been looking at the tracker for a while. There were a flurry of updates made in the last week on the tracker. Prior to that, it looked like it hadn't been updated since a year ago. It's a main tool that you discuss to communicate, to engage the community. It's hard, I think, for me and for members of the public to say, well, MCPS is taking this seriously when that's happening. And I'm glad to be a forcing mechanism. I'm glad the committee's having a session and that we change things, but it shouldn't take that. That's not, we can't do that, and so could you talk about, I know there's been transition, but I don't want that to happen going forward. So any explanation, less of explanation, more like how we're not going to make that happen. But I'm happy to hear a little bit from Dr. Alston and the team about why it took that long, and then what are we going to do to make sure that doesn't happen going forward?
Absolutely. So one of the initial components that was part of the tracker were the charters. And so the intent was that the charters are regularly meeting and updating the public, not just on the tracker, but in Board of Education meetings in regards to the work in progress. And the two were designed to go hand in hand. Right? And so as we were doing the work in charters and looking at our project management oversight committee that then examined and questioned internally before we presented externally, that shifted, right? When that process did not occur, it impacted. And so we have to do a better job of making sure that even though that project management oversight structure is not being used, that we have a set schedule where we regularly update so the community can understand and know where we are and the progress that we're making. So we'll be making specific timelines and dates and calendars so that everyone on those respective committees know when they must update. But that's how there was that disconnect, because that other component that was designed to go with it is currently not present.
And that won't, so you feel now you have that in place, and so there'll be regular updates?
Well, that project management oversight committee is still not in place. That is something that
But
has
you will
not.
have a system in place to make updates, because there is
Correct.
work happening.
Yes.
But it's just not, and what's the, on that, what about that committee? What's the next, is that going to continue, or are you going to reform that, or what?
That's a decision that I've not been made aware of as of yet.
Okay.
So I think just to, remember how I said at the start of the presentation, it was like we had the anti-racist action plan and then the strategic plan. Now that we're embedding it, I foresee that moving forward, those project management oversight committees, maybe to a different name, those will actually be committees that are organized around the strategic plan goals. So I foresee that they will be merged, and that is, once we get our strategic plan in place, that will be an added accountability structure.
And obviously, you can't have accountability if you're not tracking it, if you're not being
Exactly.
transparent with the public, if we don't know what's happening. You present some great numbers here. We just have to all be in the same system of, we can't know what's happening. All right, last question, I'll turn to colleagues. And I was glad to see the positive responses on slide 20. If we go back to slide 20 real quick, Doug, please. The around feedback on the sessions. But I was at Blair earlier this month, last month, I can't remember, recently. Last week? This week? I don't know. I was at Blair. And I met with a group of students, students of color. It was this month. And I talked to some teachers, I talked to the admin staff, and you remember there was an article about how last year, I think it's 20, that one, how poor the training was. And, things were said like it was a one-size-fits-all, it felt unreasonable, it created PTSD and anxiety, and they were wondering what actions. So when I see this slide about that everyone agreed these trainings are great, it doesn't jive with that. So I want to know, like, how are you taking the feedback of like this was harmful and I didn't like it and it didn't work well, and how are you incorporating that, and how does that jive with this data here?
So I want to acknowledge a couple things. The professional learning that you're referring to is the very first time that we engaged in district-wide professional learning for 15,000 people, focusing on anti-racism. People probably felt uncomfortable with some of the content because it was pushing some people's thinking. And we did get some of that feedback. I will say that overall, when we collected that feedback, it was actually more overwhelmingly, from a district lens, positive. But we also did hear some of the feedback around feeling like there was a one-size-fits-all approach. Since then, we've actually taken that feedback and actually for each of the subsequent district-wide professional learning days and have made a lot of changes. One of the things that we did was we heard from principals and administrators that they felt like they didn't get some of the materials for that first one in a timely manner, so they felt like they were struggling to prepare to make sure it was of value. So we made sure that they were working side by side with us to roll out the training. We also now have a committee. It's called the JPLC. I know we love our acronyms here in MCPS. But they are a committee made up of all three associations that actually review and vet our curriculum and our professional learning before we push it out to staff. Thirdly, one of the shifts that we made based on teacher feedback was teachers really wanted more autonomy and some choice in how they were engaging in the professional learning. So we turned this from a one day, you have to do it from 8 to a certain amount of time with a very clear script, to shifting that to giving schools and teachers a longer window in which to engage in the training and different options in which to how to do it. So that has yielded a lot of very positive results. And as I said before, we are constantly using the feedback that we get to move. But I also will say, as we challenge people's views and mindsets, there does come discomfort.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. I'm going to yield. You want me to go to Chris first? I'm going to go to Councilmember Mink. On the RJ stuff, I didn't ask you any direct questions because I know I'm playing team ball here. I know Councilmember Mink was going to ask some about that. But I'm happy to hear that 80% were not back into a circle. The recidivism rate was 81% last year, 79%, very similar. I think that shows us that it works. We obviously only eight coordinators across is not enough. I don't want to be rolling that back. This is me speaking. I think we shouldn't be going backwards. I think the stipends are important. Mr. Brutus is doing a lot in your building, and I know whoever your coach is, you have a coach as well. Ms. Mason. Yeah, Ms. Mason. Right, school counselor, and they have other responsibilities too. So I don't think we want to be moving in the backwards direction on that. So it's good to see that. I'll yield first to Councilmember Mink.
That was very loud. Okay.
To the left, right?
Yeah. Is that? Are we good? Audio wise.
You're
Okay.
on.
All right. Thank you all very much for engaging in this conversation. I think it's fantastic that we have principals at the table who can speak to their firsthand experience. And as Ms. Chase said, what can happen when principals really embrace the work that we're trying to do here. And I also want to note how important it is to have Ms. Chase here at the table and to have the voice of the community that has been so deeply engaged in this work and so frustrated by, as we're all acknowledging here, the lack of enough progress, quite frankly. And I know this has been said, but I'll say it again, that we're not here to like throw blame around. And I know that the folks in front of me have been working very hard. And I know that there have been blocks, points at various points along the road, and folks who are not here, folks who are here, I'm sure, across the board, who wanted to do more things and hit barriers along the way. And I don't think we need to get into all of that. I think the important thing is that we're all on the same page about moving forward. And we want everyone here, and I include our community groups, our advisory groups, we want everyone here to be empowered to do that work. And we have to, as Stephanie said, we have to create the accountability structures to drive that transparency so that we can't not allow that work to be done. To the question about the tracker, for example, to go to the transparency question there, to be honest, the tracker is not helping me a whole lot regardless, because there's no detail on there. It's very vague. You could use that tracker to do a lot of really meaningful stuff, or you could use it to do absolutely nothing and feed us a bunch of whatever. And the question is, how are we going to use it? And I think what we just heard about very diplomatically, but that sounds like an accountability process. If we were going to have regular check-ins in front of the board or the committee here or whatever, that's what would allow us to bring meaning to that tracker, because we would have the opportunity to go deeper into the work and to hear what it actually, each of those lines on the spreadsheet that could mean nothing, what is it actually, what are the numbers? What do you mean you're doing trainings? Who designed the trainings? Who attended them? Are they mandatory? Does that mean what percent? Okay, mandatory for who? Mandatory for principals? What percent of the principals actually attended? What happened if somebody declined or missed it? How are you assessing the quality of that training? What are the metrics attached to it? You can't convey all of that in a spreadsheet. That's just to open the door. And so we have to make sure that you all are empowered to come in front of us. That's where we have control, but I'm sure that the board would look forward to this as well, but that we provide those spaces where you all can come in front of us and show that work, and where everyone on the ground and everyone up above throughout the org chart knows that those check-ins are coming, and that can continue to drive the work forward. So, then people can go online and check the spreadsheet, but we have to bring meaning to the spreadsheet, and there has to be a level of detail, and I think that's really what we have been missing. And so I certainly am on board to working with all of you, working with the board and the community, and making sure that we continue to provide that space to have numbers and metrics and the accountability structures that are needed to make sure that your work is not stymied in any way. So speaking of details, I would like to get into the weeds a little bit. And I had some conversations with Dr. Taylor, and I let him, and I checked in with him that we could share that conversation here, and that was fine with him. So I wanted to better understand what the structure is going to look like for next year. It sounds like there's going to be some shifts in positions, and I think it's important that, speaking of transparency and accountability, we can't have positions disappearing if we're saying that things are important, and not have some accountability about what that means. If we're going to say that they're going to turn into something else, well, we need to be very, very clear about what that something else is going to be and how that is going to be a proper, replacement. So for my conversation with Dr. Taylor and a subsequent email exchange to confirm, the 8 restorative justice specialists, there are 8 restorative justice specialists whose positions were eliminated, and 3 equity instructional specialists and or equity training specialists, same thing, different name essentially, whose positions were eliminated or not moved into the operating budget. Those folks, those 11 people, will be placed into new roles called the professional learning specialist roles. And I checked on the word placed, double-checked on it, and then I have it in an email, which has been confirmed by Dr. Taylor. So those positions, those folks will be placed into those roles. understanding, look, I'm not in HR, there may be processes that have to be gone through, et cetera. There's also more professional learning specialist roles than there are people coming out of those roles. But, my question here was, so I can't speak to the application or HR process or whatever, but my question was, if these roles, the professional learning specialist roles, are in fact to be equity and restorative justice as their primary mission, because that's where they're coming from and that's the positions that are being eliminated, and we need more of that, not less. If that's their primary mission, then why wouldn't we take the folks who we know have expertise and were hired to do that and put them in that roles? And he completely agreed and noted that we don't have the resources to do a search that we don't have to do. So we have those folks. They will be placed into those roles. Can't speak to the HR process. And again, there are more positions there than there are folks coming out of those RJ and equity specialist positions. But I was pleased to hear that as well. So I wanted a better understanding of what those roles would encompass, and I think that this conversation, obviously, there's a lot that's going on. There's a lot of transitions that are happening. The whole school system is in the midst of transitions. We've got a new superintendent who is coming in and working to pull a lot of stuff together. So there's a lot of moving pieces. And obviously, ideally, Dr. Taylor, I'm sure, would be here explaining this better than I am. But I did not. I wanted to be able to have this conversation in an authentic way. So those folks are to be headline working on restorative justice and equity. They are to be involved in the school improvement plan process. And, the intention really needs to be there to make sure that those recommendations are made part of the school improvement plans, and that then those folks are able to support those principals in, in achieving those goals. And so by being part of those roles are part of the help me out, the cross something teams. Thank you. I don't know why I can't get that. I keep thinking it's going to be 2 C's. Cross-functional teams. So, when I started hearing little whispers about this, I was alarmed to hear that the equity and restorative justice positions would not be specifically under something called equity or restorative justice. That felt like a red flag, and I figured probably felt like a red flag out in the community as well. I know it was a red flag out in the community as well. But the intention, from what I have been told, is to make them part of that cross-functional team so that they can be part of the ongoing work with the principals and with the schools to make sure that these changes are actually being made and implemented with fidelity on a regular basis. The equity unit, so then the equity unit, what's the equity unit going to be doing? Because a lot of that work was taking place under the equity unit before. The equity unit will be designing the equity and anti-racism strategy moving forward. The system-wide strategy, system-wide training and support, making recommendations for how principals could spend the financial equity add-on in the budget, and also being built into broader school systems as a filter through which things pass for review and feedback. And obviously, as part of that, if you don't have some kind of a system or accountability measure to ensure that that feedback is not ignored, then that becomes meaningless. So that needs to be part of it as well. But that's the idea, is for it to also, the equity unit to also be a pass-through for a lot of the work that MCPS is doing broadly. And noting also the importance then of the professional learning specialists who are going to be working on the implementation side. And then the equity unit, that obviously, there needs to be some kind of plan for how those folks are not going to be siloed from each other, there needs to be a lot of integration there. So I think as things kind of get fleshed out, it'll be great to come back and learn more about what that will look like. But I think that it gives us a good starting point for how we can use this structure to really follow up on some of the, the accountability measures and transparency measures that you have both been mentioning. Gives us something to check in on. We have school improvement plans that are now going to have specific guidance for principals that are being delivered by equity professionals, restorative approaches professionals that are being put together in conjunction with the leadership from the equity unit that are going to be getting regular check-ins, and that will hopefully be coming in front of this committee, in front of the board, to see what those look like. And we have to be willing to share our successes and our failures as well as we go. I think I should I give you some time back and get back in the queue? I'm going to get back in the queue. All right. Sorry, there wasn't any questions. I'll have them when I get back.
It was breaking news that I wanted you to break, and I think good news.
I think so too.
In the sense that we're not going to be taking steps backwards. So sorry if anyone found out about that here, but there's no bad place to find out good news. Councilmember Albornoz.
Yeah, I don't know what just happened there, but just trying to figure that out. I didn't know, but anyways, so. Geez, so much to say. I'll start from this place. I appreciate Council Vice President's comments initially framing this conversation in this new normal that we are in, which is an awful normal. So it felt, frankly, a year ago like we were starting to catch our breath post-COVID. Things were starting to get back on track. And then 48 hours ago, we get a memo, 2-page memo saying all federal funding is going to freeze and all hell breaks loose. And I know you all were experiencing that. We were experiencing that on this side as well. So it just underscores the importance of this work, which is always important, but particularly now when there are many forces at a national level that are going to continue to try to divide us, and we have to remain united. So I'm happy we initiated this prior to this administration taking office. Certainly share the frustration and concern that we haven't made as much progress that people today have acknowledged we all would like to see. But I do continue to sense and honestly sense sort of the urgency. And I think everybody understands why this work, particularly right now, is so important. So I had a couple of broad questions, and they're follow-up questions to the questions I asked the last time we had a session. And I so appreciate, I love when representatives from schools come. Moving forward, it'd be great to hear more formally from families and students as well. I know that's hard because it's unfair to have one student or one parent, profess to represent the views of everyone. That's not fair. But there has to be some way moving forward that we can incorporate those voices into this conversation because they are obviously so important and they ground us, which I think are critical. But, and my son, and I've talked about this, he attends Silver Creek Middle School, and I've been blown away by Dr. Ockert and her team and the tone that they set, and you just feel it as soon as you walk through those doors. But it's coming from her leadership in partnership with the central office. And we have 2 more examples of principals here that get it, that buy in. But not everyone does, or not everyone makes this the priority that it should be. And for sometimes, understandable reasons, we're all overwhelmed. Maybe this isn't as a higher priority as we think it should be, but as others may think it's not. But how are we holding administrators accountable who aren't buying in or are not really working as diligently as they probably should be to partner with the central office and with this remarkable team to implement this strategy with fidelity? So, and then, there's a carrot here too. How are we helping them ensure that they understand the importance of this? So I'll start there and just see how you all want to respond.
So I don't know if Mr. Sean McGee wants to come up to talk about this a little bit as one of the supervisors of the principals. You can have my seat.
Hi, thank you. Sean McGee. I'm an area associate superintendent, works in the Office of School Support and Improvement. So we work very closely with the directors in this school. We use the professional growth system as a way to monitor these standards. All principals are held to 10 standards for the administrative and supportive system that we have. So it's part of the process that we work in our office of going through reviewing school improvement plans, We start that at the very beginning of the year. We have goal-setting conferences with all of our administrators. We have check-ins through them. We have supervisory visits where we go out to the schools, and we are now doing walkthroughs through the schools, looking at data, back to the accountability measures and making sure that all the data that we're looking is making progress. And like you said, if we find that there is an administrator or a school that's not making progress, we're going to first try to support them. Sometimes what that looks like is extra support from the director that works with them. Sometimes we bring in support. You heard Councilmember Mink talk about cross-functional teams. We're starting to do that now. We call them student support teams, where we bring staff from other offices to come in to support in whatever area that we might think that they're needing, whether that's sometimes it's climate, sometimes it's academics, whatever that need is. And it's a cross-office team. And I think what's happened now with our new superintendent is wants to replicate those teams and build those out for a cross-functional team for all of our offices to do that. So there's a system in place that we have in order to monitor and keep, I would say keep track, but work shoulder to shoulder with schools, especially administrators, when we don't see the progress or we may have resistance through that. There's a process that we go through. And again, if we have to get to the point where we are using the professional growth system, we can do that as well, but it really starts at a support level first from our office.
Is there a peer-to-peer? So is there a peer-to-peer opportunity? Administrators working with other administrators? I know everyone's really busy and slammed, but are we creating a time and place for remarkable representatives like we have here to be able to talk to their colleagues?
Yeah, we just started this. We were starting at the elementary level, building it out through middle and high school. We're calling it an elementary principal network, and we're looking at schools who are making wonderful growth, have great leadership, getting them together in spaces. Our first meeting actually is tomorrow at Wilson Wims Elementary School. We have about 10 to 12 elementary principals getting together to talk about what's working in their school, to see walkthroughs through that school, what can we learn from that, and then we will rotate around as we go through this year to try to make that a bigger cohort of principals and administrators just to start learning from each other. But absolutely, that's on the plans, and I would think that's going to continue throughout this year and into next year as well.
Thank you. And I'll follow up on some specific examples of schools where we've heard concerns raised, but I appreciate that response for now. The other question I had was, this body, the council, has gone through a significant change over the last 4 or 5 years, looking at ourselves in the mirror and what we can do better as an institution to make sure everybody feels seen and heard and respected. And one of the important components of that is ensuring that there, as we hear in other ways, no wrong door. Students feeling comfortable coming forward to a trusted adult within the school, no matter who that is, to be able to report feeling bullied, feeling discriminated against, feeling belittled. How are we ensuring that whether it is a driver of a bus, whether it is a security official, whether it is a teacher, whether it's an administrator, whether it's somebody else in the school, I know we're conducting trainings, but how are we ensuring that beyond these remarkable professionals who are already overwhelmed with a lot more on their plates than they can probably handle, how are we ensuring that everyone is feeling this sense of inclusion and feeling comfortable receiving that information from students and then knowing what to do with it?
So that's a tough question. And I think it boils down to a few things. You pointed out something, Councilmember, that I think is really important. And you just said, I know we do trainings, but we're not going to train our way out of racism.
Right.
Okay, so I want to be clear on that. Because I can train you, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to change your mindset. We know mindset is sometimes the most difficult thing to change. It's an ongoing process. And I think creating the conditions in school environments and in all environments where people have to hear difficult things and have to engage in those difficult conversations, and we have to create the conditions to do so. But what we can't do, in my opinion, and this is me speaking, is make the statement that this is optional or that this might not be a top priority. It is the priority. And the reason that it is that racism in particular is a life or death situation for many kids and many of our members of our community. So when we're dealing with a life and death situation, we can't say that this is an optional thing or this is something that, is nice to have. It is the future of an entire generation. So I say that to say we have to be courageous. We have to take the challenging hits on things when we're not doing it well and hold people accountable when it's not. So when you ask a question around how are we making sure that this is happening in the schools, it has to be ever present in the conversations that are happening from the administrative level all the way down. I know that in the operations space, they do anti-racist trainings with their bus drivers, with the security personnel. That's a great start, but it can't end there. And I think that is going to be an ongoing process that we're probably not going to solve in 6 months, but it's something that we have to be courageous to do.
Thank you. I'll get back in the queue probably, but I don't know if we have time.
We'll keep going till we're done, and then we'll do it again more often. It'll in another 3 months or so. Just two things, and then I'll turn back to Councilmember Mink, who I know has further questions. The slide on the RJ side where it showed the levels where the schools are, Mr. Prouty, if we could just go there real quick. And this is an example. I'm glad you asked the question you did, Councilmember Albornoz, because I was going to ask something similar. So unreported, there's 8 schools that are unreported, and I want to make sure I understand what that means before I ask my question. So please explain unreported.
So we have some data on those schools, but it's from our perspective. The evaluations are done in a team conducted by the school. So it's not outsiders that come in and tell you who you are, what you are, how you're doing. The school team does it. So the RJ coach, administrator, members of the team that are selected, parents are invited to join in some teams, students are invited to join in some teams, and they do a comprehensive analysis in each of the 15 categories. And they don't just analyze it, they provide artifacts. So if you say, we create a sense of belonging, and we do so through X, Y, Z, 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 town halls, you send in the planning documents for those town halls, the visuals that were used, the videos that were showed, you list the events that occurred. So it's really a school examining itself. Sure. So we work to make sure that all schools do that. We go, we support, we participate on a great deal of these. But invariably, there are always teams that either don't work together as a team to get one done, or the leadership will say something like, oh, my RJ coach is on long-term medical leave, or something will happen where it's an incomplete picture of that school. One person may have tried to attempt it, and so those aren't fair to report out because those results are not to the depth or breadth of what the others are. So they're not reliable results, so they're unreported.
That are in that category?
Yes. And we have an idea of where we think they fall, and we apply supports to where we think they fall, but every other school is self-reported.
Obviously, that could be, if you're hearing that for the first time,
Sure.
that could seem to be an indication of
yes, and
lack
actually,
of seriousness with which the work is undertaken.
actually, that in itself is a data point, right? The schools that are unreported itself is a data point in terms of the service and what
I would be concerned if my child went to an unreported school.
Right.
I'm just going to be serious. Or an early school or reactive school, right? I would want to know what's going on, like to move them into the next category.
Less so for an early school, more so for a reactive school. And I say that because I want to be fair to our schools and our school leaders.
Sure,
A couple
yeah.
of reasons. Some of the schools went through initial RJ introduction in 2016 before this was a mandate from the state. Other schools were part of the study. 43 schools were part of the study that received extra training, research coaches, all of those things. So they have right. So it's almost like it would be not fair to say your school's been in it for 6 years and your school's only been in it for 3 years and I expect the same things. There are other things that are interesting, like Cabin Branch Elementary School is one of these. That's a newer school that's much higher in their progress. Well, their principal, when she was in AP, was at a treatment school that went through all of that. So when she hired with that in mind. So even though it's a younger school, they have a little bit further progress. So there's so many variables that I try not to put like so much judgment on one or the other, with the exception of reactive school, right? Because the reactive schools, you really have to be doing not a lot at all to be coded as reactive. And remember, this is a self-evaluation. That's not me or members of my team saying that it's the school acknowledging that this is what we have, this is where we are.
Those 5 schools.
What are they? Oh, I know what they are, but I don't know that it would be fair to necessarily publicize that when that hasn't been something that we have shared with the schools. I can ask.
Well, they don't know where they are.
Well, they know where they are. They do it. I'm saying we usually publish.
Public doesn't know who's on these lists?
So we publish to the board what the schools are. We send it in a board memo, but there isn't a live database that says, here's where every school is. Right? It's a tool for planning. And I wonder, too, with a self-evaluation, if we did publish that out to the public as just a broad document, would schools automatically just start rating themselves higher? Right? It's a metric that is self-evaluation for that school, and it's important to use in terms of planning and progress.
I appreciate that. I mean, I think I share your concern about the reactive and also happiness that it's gone down.
Yeah.
But I think what folks would want to know, even though it's a self-reported internal tool, is what we're doing
Right.
to move people along.
So those reactive schools all have distinct action plans. So their RJ specialist meets with them more regularly than other schools. They have a monthly meeting. They have an action plan on how to move from one category to the other. Just the reactive schools. The other schools don't have the same level of action planning. And so those schools moving from 20 to 4 or 5, that's not an accident. Yeah. They have been intentionally working towards that.
And I think to underscore something my colleagues have both alluded to or said directly, this has to be taken seriously by everybody.
I agree.
And there has to be accountability and there has to be support, right? It has to do the work, right?
Agree.
And I know we don't disagree. So I think we're all swimming in that direction, particularly now, in the face of what's happening now. We have to I think we have to do even better than we've done, and that's always the Montgomery County problem. We're better than most.
I agree. And then you know what?
We still have to hold ourselves to a standard.
With the changes coming, if they do pass at the state level, the state will have an evaluation metric, right? Which may be in alignment with our metric because it's developed by their informal metric, and it may not. So we have to be, looking at that to see, based on what they develop, how our system is in alignment, and then where to go from that. That might lead to further planning, or it might stay similar. So those are considerations.
We need that help for our budget considerations too. Councilmember Mink.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to note before I get to questions that I want to appreciate Councilmember Albornoz for lifting up the question about administrators and how we're keeping tabs on that, because that is an area that we need improvement. It just is. Sometimes we have events that make the news. Sometimes we have events that don't make the news. But regardless, it's clear that we have many, many great and wonderful principals. I benefited from them myself. My kids are benefiting from them right now. But we can look at the climate and culture survey from a couple of years ago and see that there are definitely areas of concern, and that shows up in some really troubling ways. Sometimes we all find out about them, the adults, and sometimes we don't. And thinking about those is really painful as well, with what our kids are going through on the ground when those issues are not being solved, not to mention staff. So making sure that we get that right, leadership right, even though by and large, most of it is excellent and wonderful. People are here because their hearts are in the work. But we're MCPS, and we have a job to do, and there are some holes in this area as well. And, so I'm not going to name any names, but there are principals who have been named highly effective who are not showing up well in that climate and culture survey, who are not showing up well in the news or what have you. Like, there are repairs that need to be made here. And so through this strategic planning process and with the obvious kind of reshuffles of how some of this is going to work, and I think we're moving in a really positive direction. But I would certainly be interested in hearing an update on what improvements can be made there as well. So I think some of this obviously is going to be a return conversation. But I would love to hear if anyone up here, and I include our wonderful principals in this also, If you have thoughts about what kind of mandatory trainings should be prioritized, whether that is for principals or principal supervisors or for all staff, if you had, and there's a couple buckets of that, and it all comes with a different price tag, and we don't have a lot for paying out any price tags at this point, we can all acknowledge. But if we can think about what do you think would be really a good use of something focused. Let's say you had a little bit of pre-service time. Or let's say you had a little bit of time to have your, professional learning staff who's in the school. They're going to include that in, an existing staff session. So now you've got a shorter, so if you have, and maybe you don't have anything now, but if any of you do, it would be great to hear that. And I include you, Ms. Chase, in that as well, if you have any thoughts on that. Yeah.
So one of the things we have built out is that we have built out professional learning in regards to hate, bias, and racism and how that impacts. So we've developed about 6 sessions that equal about 6 hours of professional learning that's designed to be for all school-based individuals to begin with, and then also looking at how we support the district. And so we're waiting for the time where we're able to move that forward so that we can go with that as well. We did present that to members of the Hate Bias Advisory Committee, so they had an opportunity to preview that prior to. We've already engaged in professional learning with 2 members from each of our schools, all of our schools in regard to that. So some of them have begun to dabble in some of those areas and looking at how and where they can begin to implement some of that.
That's great. Thank you.
So I think universal design for learning would be a really great point because as you were sharing earlier, it really does, engagement is really important for students in the classroom, and that's where we're seeing some of the challenges with teachers. And when the content is engaging, that's where you're going to have what we're talking about, some of the behavior challenges, as well as if a student already knows something, they don't want to. They're not going to be in class. Mm-hmm. So how can we, and also reimagining what professional learning looks like, so that we're looking at the curriculum and we're embedding some of this universal design for learning within the curriculum. So, like teachers are actually able to, curriculum study, bring in people that are experts in, okay, let's engage our students more in what we're doing and how can we, students all learn differently, so how can we build some of that into what we're doing? Because I will tell you, engagement is a challenge in the classroom for students, and also adapting work. How do we adapt the work so that students can be engaged in these high-level learning classes that you're speaking about? And be able to access these rich texts that we're talking about that students should be able to access. So those are kind of my thinking.
Yeah, and I would say on the social-emotional side, if I were to think about something being mandatory, is really for staff, all staffs, teachers, administrators, counselors, how do they develop the skills to cultivate peer-to-peer relationships? And when I look at our Maryland State Report Card student survey, our strength was in staff-to-student relationships. We scored the highest at Julius West in staff and students, so students feel they have a pretty good relationship with their teachers, but we scored much lower in student-to-student relationships. And we need adults. We need adults to facilitate those skills and to cultivate those skills with kids, because the kids left to their own devices don't know how to do that. So I think, and I spoke earlier about how we're trying to empower our staff and build the capacity of our staff to facilitate discussions and dialogue among kids. The disruptions in schools, cafeterias, hallways, classrooms are largely with peers. Mm-hmm. And we need to teach them on a regular basis. It needs to be built in on a daily basis on how to relate to one another. Mm-hmm. And they're comfortable coming to us, and we've improved in that area. But they need skills on how to interact with one another. So on their own, they can problem solve better.
Great, thank you.
I would say that there, and Dr. Alston, I just want to say that they did share those trainings with us, but I would extend that to that it is mandatory, that it is not asynchronous, right, and that there are measurable outcomes attached to that. Right, so if you've taken this training, no, you can't change heart and minds, but MCPS could have a requirement that if you've taken this training and there you are a high-impact school, for instance, then we should see, as a result of that, some of those numbers go down, right, in terms of suspensions, in terms of access to rigor, and principals being supported to succeed. So there needs to be something attached to that. It can't just be you took the training, it was mandatory, and then nothing changes. That has to go away. That can't keep happening. And then I think, I think it's awesome that that's happening in your school, that there is a, teacher to student relationship that is built, and there's that. But that doesn't happen at every school, unfortunately. Right, and so, and I've heard from many teachers who say that is actually what is missing. And so, I would love some sort of training, and I know it exists, and I don't know how to even say it, or I'll say it, and then Dr. Alston can say if it exists. But some sort of training whereby staff has to examine themselves and their own biases, and how do you come to these things, right? How do you show up versus how you think you show up for your students, right? Because those can be very disconnected, can be very different. I happen to have developed a training like that. I can talk about it later. But, but it is, to Stephanie's point, a courageous conversation, but these things need to keep on happening. But our staff, our teachers need to be supported in having those conversations so that we can, they can, for example, and should be adept at stopping things that are harmful in the moment, right? If two students, two black students say, "What's up, my N-word," to each other, right, which they want to do, that is not something that I think they should be suspended for, or all these things that happen. But if we have staff that are adept and trained at being able to stop that in the moment and make that a teachable moment, right, then that is something that should be happen. There are too many people who are not adept at doing that, and so it escalates and all kinds of things happen that take our children away from their learning. And then the last thing I'll say is something about some training or something that teaches folks how to look at, especially our black and brown students, as children, and not to attribute adult, put adult attributes towards those children. Right, I think that would go a long way, and so I don't know how to put that, but that's.
I think you put all of that perfectly. Thank you. That's all really helpful. Thank you. And so much of that of what you just said, Ms. Chase, is really applicable to everything that everybody else said, because we really need those standards attached, or these trainings are going to be meaningless, which is honestly a lot of what we have right now. So yes, having those measurable outcomes attached, and I'll. Just to add a little bit of detail on that, as we look at those metrics, being able to have, first of all, rates instead of numbers would be really helpful. So what percent, so like can we get, I think, slide 33? Other way.
There we go.
Okay, that's very loud. All right, so there's a couple different slides. So this one, we have some rates on here, but having a comparison rate also, and I know, because we've had conversations before also, that this is reflecting real success that is real. But to be able to make the case that we want to make as strongly as possible, and to advocate for the budget that we want to be able to continue to increase these efforts. Just thinking about how we really, prove the point. And so to be able to say in schools where this intervention took place, where they got this type of staff member, where they took this training, that the rates of, suspensions of black students, for example, decreased this much from this year to this year, whereas the rates in other comparable schools only decreased this much. That'll be really helpful, I think, for knowing also which trainings are the most effective if we have to make tough decisions about what to move forward with. Having those comparisons and having them be rates instead of numbers in some of these cases would be really helpful. That's just kind of like a data nerd comment, but I'm thinking about budget advocacy and how useful that would be as a tool. Sorry. Oh, yes, please. Yeah.
No, I was going to say thank you for that. I prefer to speak in suspension rates rather than suspension numbers. Sometimes, though, it's difficult for people to see the difference, especially if it's like a tenth and we're looking at it from a system. That might represent like 150, right? And it's not all the same. But I appreciate that advocacy because it's a conversation we've had around the strategic plan.
Great. Thank you for that insight. Having clarity too, when we come back to talk in more detail, and obviously there's a lot to get that you all, we knew that coming into this conversation, have to get worked out. And I'm excited about that because I think we need a fresh start. I think everybody here kind of agrees that we need a fresh start, and this is an opportunity. And I want everybody here to be empowered to do that. That it'll be great to hear about what exactly are the trainings that are planned for this year, and maybe aspirationally down the line when we have more money. And then included in that are the pieces that Ms. Chase mentioned. We want to know like which ones are asynchronous and which are not, what's mandatory and what's not, how that's going to be reported out, how many attendees there actually were, what's going to happen if somebody doesn't attend, and then what are the outcome metrics that you're going to use to think about whether this worked or not. And there's going to be a lot of variables at play, so that might be tricky. But I think we have to try. We can't just put stuff out there and then hope that it's useful. So it'd be great to have clarity on that. And then the other one other piece that we haven't talked as much about, but was touched on, was the code of conduct that I understand that is going to get another look as well. And we really need. It's confusing, like it's really complicated. And thinking about a student trying to use that and to know if I choose this behavior, what's going to happen, like you really can't tell. And there's so much discretion given to principals. And Ms. Chase gave a great example of what could happen if you have a principal or other leadership in the school who's kind of highly trained and prepared to address some of these issues that come up versus if you don't, you can get totally different, results from that. So having clarity in the code of conduct, yes, training, yes, you want to change people's attitude and all of this, but like there's got to just be some rules, a less discretion I think would be helpful for everyone. So it would be great to see, and from my conversation with Dr. Taylor, it's he brought this up before I did, but to have a code of conduct where there is more clarity about that there is an expectation that you're going to go to restorative approaches first, and what that looks like for different behaviors before you move into other types of consequences, which obviously has implications around training, et cetera, for how you do that. But I think that would be so helpful and is a really important point that was raised. Okay. And I'll get back in the queue.
You're the only one left.
I'm the only one. Oh, how long we got? I'll stay in the queue. Okay.
In the next 5 minutes or so.
Okay.
We're already over, but I'm letting you roll.
Oh, I appreciate it.
We told them 3 too, so.
Y'all were told 3? Yeah. All right. Well, let me just say in closing that I so deeply appreciate everyone in this room and the conversation that we're having today, which has been really forthright and I think really productive. And I'm excited about this age of transparency that we are moving into. Let's be very honest about our successes and our failures because that's the only way that we're going to see change. So we don't want to hold any of that past, against anybody. We're all here to move forward into the future with metrics attached, lots of transparency, lots of accountability, no game playing, and always having community at the table to keep us to it. So thank you all so much.
Amen to that. And to answer Councilmember Mink's question, like this is the anti-racist plan, like that, and my staff marked this up, and thank you, staff. I think it should be a good tool. Like, don't throw it out. Let's make it meaningful. Mm-hmm. I think, and make it up to date and detail oriented and something that we can hold ourselves accountable to. We will come back to this in this type of setting after budget, which will be in the summer. But before then, throughout the next sessions, we're going to have 10 or so sessions between education and culture and HHS and education and culture about a whole range of things before we get into the budget formally in the committee, which happens at the beginning of April. So if there are updates, this won't be the last time you all will be with us. If there's anything to share, let us know. Let Mr. Prouty know. But I do think this is hardening to hear, and there's work to do, but really appreciate everyone's commitment to it. And thank you again to our principals who took their time and to everyone who's taken their time With that, we are adjourned. Thank you.